Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have a great thrust about them. Bowdlerizing the Bard in this way gives you a very accurate picture of the last speaker on this panel. The driving force and inspiration behind How, the Journal of Ethnographic Theory, and How books, he has been waving a flag for open access since 2011. Against the prediction that How would fold within a year, he not only persevered, but made it into a flagship anthropology journal of extraordinary intellectual caliber, all entirely for free, a true gift of ideas, debates, and discussions. He is How's editor-in-chief and the director of publications of the Center for Ethnographic Theory. Meet the man on top of the pile, Giovanni da Col.
Thank you very much. I wish to start with two provocations, my talk. And the two provocations in questions can be summarized as follows. So many of the social instances traditionally encompassed by anthropological inquiry within the category of gift-giving are rather manifestations of hosting situations and events. What if hospitality constitutes the transcendental field of value creation and relation of exchange? And the second, what does anthropological theories of gift-giving, how do they speak to contemporary ideologies of gratuity in open access scholarship? So Marilyn Strathern once argued that methodology is always regional, that some regions of the world seem to provide location for the pursuit of particular problems in anthropological theory, whereas others do not. A crucial anthropological strategy can be deployed by taking invented concepts in different ethnographic contexts to rearrange, negate, or invert a relationship between familiar terms. The gift proved to be the egregious anthropological construct to be subject to such negative strategies. This is the case of inquiries such as Parry's transposition of the Maori gift in India, who showed that the status of the Indian gift, dana, is not predicated on an ideology of reciprocity, but rather relies on a soteriology. The gift which is returned is not a gift. That a subject-defining relation of masterhood, I would say, also replicated linguistically on different scales. For example, the dak in Tibetan used for indicating both the householder, the spirit, and the landmaster and the owner, the patron. The same in Ed, the Mongolian, or in other Turkic and Siberian languages. So, and this relation of mastery transcends simple expression and relations of ownership, authority, or domination. In this zone, which I and my colleague Adam Chow call it completely arbitrary, a cumulus cultural zone, we find a surprising propensity for social practices related to hosting and hospitality, sacrifice to gain favor from a patron, host, land, or spirit master, and very subjecting and concerns for accumulation, storage, hoarding, containership, and related preoccupations with leakages and parasitism. Now, Benveniste also noticed that there is an obvious connection that joins the notion of the gift and that of hospitality, and indeed hospitality emerges over and over in anthropological literature, entangled with the gift as an implicit or passing reference point. So it is then time to return to one of my previous thought experiments. Imagine what anthropology might look today if Marcel Mauss had chosen hospitality rather than the gift as a subject of his 1924 treatise. So this alternative future for anthropology could be brought into being by an alternative theoretical scenario. What if the logic of hospitality encompasses relation of sharing, giving, or trading? What if hospitality is the transcendental field of value production and transformation? It may well be that in Mauss' essay, hospitality does not appear indeed as a subcategory of the gift, but rather one of the conditions of the possibility for gift-giving and forms of generalized exchange, I quote, "To trade, the first condition was to lay aside a spear. From then onwards, society succeeded in exchanging goods and persons, no longer only between clans, but between tribes and nations, and above all, between individuals." The epigraph from the Norse collection of religious poems Havamal, chosen by Mauss to introduce the gift, is indeed concerned with reciprocity. Yet it is named Gestatter, the guest section, which comprises the rules, manner of relationship for being a guest while traveling and handling relation with horse in Norse ancient society. Indeed, for Mauss, hospitality intertwines with gift-giving as the most basic human acts foregrounding all relationship of alliance and affinity. I quote again, "For a clan, a household, a group of people, a guest have no option but to ask for hospitality, to receive present, to enter into trading, to contract alliances through wives and blood kinship. To refuse to give, to fail to invite, just as a refuse to accept, is tantamount to declaring war. It is to reject the bond of alliance and commonality." The essay's last chapter contains most famous invitation to return to the joy of expenditure, which is also the pleasure of hospitality. Once again, we shall discover those modes of action still remembered by many society and classes. The joy of giving in public, the delight in generous artistic expenditure, the pleasure of hospitality in public or private feast. In the conclusion, Mauss thus returned to the law of hospitality as a juridical and economic institution developed in an advanced society. Quote again, "Until legal systems and economies evolved not far removed from our own, it is always with strangers that one deals, even if allies," writes Mauss. Pre-modern society had to rely on tribal festivals and ceremonies, where peace had to be maintained by the law of friendships and contract with the gods. Is then hospitality an ideological abstraction or an institution or a more specific cognitive orientation or field for the transformation of values? We had to wait until Nancy Mann's work on the value creation and transmission among the Masim of Papua New Guinea for a perspective in which hospitality appears as encompassing the logic of sharing and exchange. Mann's focus is how actors control the social world through transformational acts of value creation. Instead of focusing on the partition of a person achieved by gift exchange, Mann highlights how a person is equally extended and dispersed by act of hospitality. Hospitality is the if read correct as I read Mann, is the transcendental field of value transformation which allows sharing to take place and the potency of a person to be deployed in concrete material exchanges, which extend the intersubjective space-time, defined by Mann as the space of self-other relationship formed in and through acts and practices. For Mann, hospitality hence constitutes this transcendental field where the contractions and extensions of the intersubjective space-time occur. Witchcraft, selfishness, and greediness subvert space-time by negating and consuming one's capacity to extend and diffuse their influence, while this act of sharing food, predicated upon the framing device of hospitality, is the template of value creation which externalizes the self beyond the physical person, hence achieving control over space-time. Hospitality activates the possibility of further construction of value by enabling alliances, higher level of exchange, the acquisition of cooler shells, and the value conversion of trading acts and localized influence into virtue of fame. Wherefore, as we know, as many have written before, for Mauss, gift-giving ground our conceptions of sociality and relatedness, but a paradigmatic form of the gift was an extension of was the sacrificial theory he developed with Hubert, where a part of the person is relinquished to another being in order to elicit a reciprocation of grace, favors, substance, spirit, or body. As it is a field of participation, hospitality is also the ideal field for sacrificial action. This is certainly not unheard. For the Tien, every feast in ancient Greece was a sacrificial moment. Feasting in other tradition is a way of reclassifying and eating what may otherwise not be eaten to make available for human consumption what cannot otherwise be consumed. But the ability to give and still keep also is a special position that the lord of the state or a patron of a sacrifice or a wealthy host enjoys. Is generosity being not a sort or an investment designed to bring a return, by an expression of the sort of permanent, inalienable wealth he already has, titled to land, status, and fame. This is Annette Wiener's attempt to displace the Maussian justification of exchange in an ideology of reciprocity by showing that possession of certain things can never be relinquished as gifts. It is to the paradox of retaining things endowed with high value or mana, while other goods are exchanged, that the status of the donor is increased and his relationship with the gods maintained. As I earlier argued, it is the capacity to control the leakage of fortunate energy during hospitality events which preserve the Tibetan household internal productive sources of prosperity and the capacity to redistribute external wealth. For Wiener, Malinowski's school exchange cannot be justified by an ideology of reciprocity. She rather suggests that the accumulation of kulak cells, which will later become an inalienable possession, resemble the prized wealth acquired in ancient Greeks. But to describe this form of ancient Greek social form, she used the word xenia, which is the Greek form of guest ritualized friendship. So we can see that, and we can notice in Wiener how the retention, the objects retained, which become also inalienable, are also the ones which constitute the condition for hospitality and generate further fame for the host and the household thereof. Or I quote from Wiener, just as the feudal lords, through their authority vested in their estates, attracted merchants, peasants, and monks. So talking about hospitality and this and the relation between hospitality and the gifts brings me to a final point, a brief final point I want to make. So each year, from December 13 to January 6, my daughter has three kind of what I call cosmo-economic encounters. One is called Santa Lucia, one is called, of course, Santa Claus, and one is called La Befana. The first two figures incarnate that mysterious human phenomenon that Gerson called, which is cited by Mauss in his essay, famously promoted as silent trade. That is, the exchange of goods between two parties who will never meet face to face, never communicate directly, never discuss the nature of the trade. Santa Lucia will expect her sweet-carrying donkey to be fed with yellow polenta flour and a glass of milk. Left on the balcony, Santa Claus will enjoy some cookies near the Christmas tree. American children may add milk and carrots for the reindeers, while British children may lay out some mince pies and sherry. Befana is an old woman witch who rides a broom and enters houses to fill thick woolen stockings, which children leave hanging above the fireplace with either candies, if they have been good during the previous year, or coal, if they have been naughty. All these clandestine happenings represent not just silent trade, but what David Graeber called ingeniously gift by stealth, a kind of reverse burglary where the donor forces himself into the recipient's house to leave a gift. In its radical form, like with Befana, the purpose of the gift by stealth is that no counter-gift is expected, and sometimes the donor can be neither identified nor thanked. Now, this is a condition that, as open access editor, I felt very much. The question of pure and fair gift has been fairly debated in anthropology, especially by Parry's articles, which make clear that the whole ideology of pureness is just our invention. Carry too, as I said, ideologies of pure gift accompany the rise of industrial capitalism. The dilemma does not affect the gift per se, but rather our ideology of gratuity. In most society, a gift is never really free, although we did develop a theory of how it should be free. Now, that is not really preposterous to say that the association of open access with the free gift, that Howe also used from the beginning, is a gimmick too, a theory of gratuity that we use quite effectively. There are few doubts that the whole discourse of gratuity affecting academic publishing may be an ideological side effect of an increased corporatization of academia and the obscene profit of commercial publisher, rather than a reality into itself. So I want to leave you with this reflection. So how can we analyze the social life of open access ethnographically and through the corpus of anthropological theories of gifts? How and why open access should be free? How it should be sustained, and whether it's precisely, in a sense, the freedom and the facility of access that may all have an influence of the value of the publication, in a sense that if we want to think, for example, with Simmel and Alfred Gell, more resistance, in a sense, to reach a certain desired object, more the value is increased. And that is also, the value of the object increased. And then maybe that could be also a reason why open access also has a limit. So I wanted to conclude with this and ask you, with these two provocations, which I think have been somehow coming out, one from my field, one from my experience as editor, which is a field in itself. And thank you very much for this. And if you have to, if I had to conclude with a sentence, actually, I would conclude that how is paid, as Mauss would say, by the counterfeit coin of its dreams.